And then the book came out, and we had a bottle of wine together, and we listened to it, and it was so wonderful. And then they said, "Oh, do you want to do another one?" And we said, "Yeah, we'll do another one." And then but then we were much, we sat down and plotted it. We were much more sensible about it. We learned from it.
Part of the challenge of this was, how do you explain these things to anyone who is not familiar with Australia's culture?
Yeah,
that, like, you have to get both the idea that they exist, but also the ubiquity of them, and that everyone knows about them. The worst part is, I now have a 3-year-old, and she has picked up my habit of walking around the house mumbling about all the things you have to get done.
I love that.
But then hers is like, she'll be listing like farm animals, but she does it in the way that she's got so many deadlines this week. So it's like pig, cow, sheep.
I love that. So the brief is, we need to pretend no one else is here, and that we're at a cafe.
Okay.
And go. Do you feel a little bit? I feel first we're allowed to talk about anything.
Yeah.
I've never been sat in a room and said, "Hey, you can talk about anything."
I'm usually told exactly what I'm not allowed to talk about.
Oh, there you go.
The ABC pays lawyers to tell me exactly what I'm not allowed to say.
Yeah, there's nothing off limits now. It's nothing. I have a question. Actually, I have 2 questions. I'll start with an easy one. So before I was a writer, I used to fantasize about how cool it will be if I have a cool job for when someone says, "Hey, what do you do?" Yeah. And then it happened, and now I hate when people ask what I do. Yeah. I feel really weird and self-conscious. Is that a thing?
It is a bit, because there's because I again had the same. I thought it would be Socceroo. It didn't end up being Socceroo.
It's never too late.
But I think when you say comedian, there was always comedian for me, and you can see like there's about a 4 or 5 second period where people are like, "Are you funny though?"
That's harder. That's way harder, because be funny. Yeah. Oh, okay, you're a comedian. Be fun. Yeah, that would be really hard.
How does crime writer go specifically? I imagine that's a whole different area.
It usually goes. So what do you do? And I say, "Oh, I'm a writer," and they look at me like, "Oh, okay. What's your real job?" And then I say, "No, I write some thriller," and I'm really nervous. I write horror and thriller, and then usually they'll either say, "Oh, I can't watch horror," or they'll just be really into it, and then it'll go from there. But no, I think it's a hard thing to navigate, though. I mean, I used to think, what a cool thing. I was just got back from the States 2 days ago, and you have to write when you come back, and you have to write your occupation. And I used to think, when I was writing, picks apples, I used to think, wouldn't it be cool to write, writer? And even that, it feels weird. It feels like I'm faking it. Isn't that funny?
It does feel like they're going to call you on it at customs. Yeah. All right, tell me a sentence right now.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Write me something.
How much do you get, because you must have in the same way that it's my job to be thinking of jokes and bits all the time, you must have to have some element of crime on the mind at different times, or what's a horrible thing that could happen here?
Yeah, always. Yeah, that's my life. And I sort of, people who aren't creative think this is rubbish, but it's true. You'll know this, that when you're just walking around doing nothing, you are still working. You are still working out things. And it's such a common scene for me to be sitting quietly in a chair in a well-lit room doing nothing, and my wife will come in and say, "Hey, have you seen?" And I'll scream. And I freak out because I'm so deep, and she'll get scared and go, "Jesus!" And now, I've got a 7-year-old daughter. The same thing. She'll be like, we came over in the plane this morning, and she and I said, "Hey, Lisa," I leaned in, and she whipped her head around sort of fast, and like this, and I went, So I think I do. I'm always processing bits and pieces, but I kind of love that. It's how I've always operated, and it actually was so recent, and I mean, a week or 2 ago, that I suddenly realised not everyone's brain works that way. Not everyone is sort of thinking about story all the time. And but yeah, it's clearly the same for you, right? Are you in a funny situation and think, I've got to write it down?
I feel like there's a lot of that. There's a lot of just finding some bit of joy and be like, how can I mine this?
Yeah.
But there's also, I do the same thing of the sitting perfectly still, except my wife, I didn't realize this until she started imitating it in front of me. I play out arguments in my head just purely through facial expression.
Oh, so can you give us a demonstration?
So as I'm running, And
Wow, I could follow that.
And there was a lot of like mum. The worst part is I now have a 3-year-old, and she has picked up my habit of walking around the house mumbling about all the things you have to get done.
I love that.
But then hers is like, she'll be listing like farm animals, but she does it in the way that she's got so many deadlines this week. So it's like pig, cow, sheep.
I love that. I love thinking about what, what's your daughter's name?
Grace.
What Grace will grow up thinking and being, and how cool that will be to have, because your wife is a creative as well.
Yes, yeah.
I want to ask you about that too, because I wrote a couple of novellas for Audible with my wife. She's also a writer, and we co-wrote on that, and that was just such a wonderful but hellish experience.
How do you work together?
Well, now we're really good. The first one, we had this huge argument right in the middle, and it was all my fault. It was because I'd gone, she'd written a draft or something, and I'd just gone in and cut it all out and changed it. And she started crying. She was like, "What was wrong with it?" And what it was is I just hadn't shown my workings. I just had gone in there and was just a brutal jerk. And there's also these sort of weird, power dynamics going on, because it was, I don't know, there's something sort of weird about, because she was coming on to, my book, not really, but it was kind of like that. Yeah. So it was really hard. And we said halfway through, we had this huge argument and just said, let's never, ever do this again. This was a terrible idea. And then the book came out, and we had a bottle of wine together, and we listened to it, and it was so wonderful. And then they said, "Oh, do you want to do another one?" And we said, "Yeah, we'll do another one." And then we were much, we sat down and plotted it. We were much more sensible about it. We learned from it. Nearly very closely came, ended in divorce.
We kind of went the opposite way about it. After the first day of writing together, it wasn't working. And we're like, "Oh, this is a shame. This isn't working at all." And then we realized we were being too polite. And so if we're in a writer's room, I would just say, "I don't care for this idea," or "No, we need to find something else." But we were like going down paths we didn't need to go down. And we had this agreement where Miranda was like, "So should we just be honest with each other right up front?" And I said yes. And she went, "I fucking hate your ideas."
That's amazing.
I really like, there was something
liberating, right?
I remember in the acknowledgements at the end of Wife and the Widow, you mentioned that she came up with, helped you with the twist.
100%, yeah.
So we have just gone through this exact situation where I had been working on a script and pulling my hair out of this thing isn't working, and it turned out the solution was something Miranda proposed 4 weeks ago, and I was like, no.
I hate when that happens.
What are you thinking?
I hate when that happens. There's been times where I'll fight against something, and it's like, "No, they were right. That person was right." Yeah. It's funny to talk about in a writer's room, because not many people have that experience. I both have that experience, right? And when I don't like something in a writer's room, I have this way of saying it, and I say, "It's not a love connection for me." That's how I phrase it. So it's still kind of polite. But they're weird places, aren't they, writers' rooms?
Yeah, absolutely. I always remember there's an old story of Conan O'Brien's way of rejecting a joke is to go, "Yeah," and and we know it's always the tiniest thing. I've worked so long with Will Anderson, and his is always, and that's all it is. And you don't, and it just means go find something else.
Yeah, but so when it's a good idea, they'll say, "That's a good idea." I don't hate it. Wow,
that is very much Gruen shorthand. Yeah, you do not go beyond anything. I don't hate it. That sounds like
torture. I would need a little bit. I'm too needy for that.
That is the thing with comedy as well, that it feels like you're not just saying, "I don't like that idea," you're saying, "You're not funny." And there's so much self-worth built up with that idea.
Well, it's totally different. It's actually... I started out wanting to write comedy, and I realized very, very quickly I was just really bad at it. And I leaned into the darker stuff, and it was good. But then last year or the year before, I worked on Deadlock, the comedy crime series. And I was obviously dragged on because I'm the crime guy. And I had so much fun writing that script because I was trying to be funny.
Yeah.
But it's so much more pressure, I think, to be fun. I think it's just easy to tell us to write a scary scene than to write a funny scene. I think it's a really tricky thing to do.
Because I feel of them as just two different ways of exposing tension. That either both ones are about the build up and then the release. And I remember when I was first reading your work, I was excited that the jokes were good. There are so many that...
But I think they only seem good because they're in the context of a thriller. I think if that was a comedy, you'd be like, this is a terrible joke.
That's fair, because you come in with a real... No, with all due respect, I would have felt they were terrible if they were terrible.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's a sort of a quiet scene, and then someone farts. And then it's like, I wouldn't ordinarily laugh at that fart, but because it was in this weird, tense scene, that's my secret, I think.
So I think that's entirely the trick, like that we use the same thing all the time. And I feel like that... I have found one of the more interesting things about translating to fiction is learning to not undercut whatever emotion you have. Like, it feels like for a long time I wrote everything like a Peanuts cartoon where you have like 3 panels of philosophy and then one be like, that doesn't matter though. Yeah. And it's like having to sit in that moment and be like, no, actually I'm okay with not... Because also comedians have this real thing that... particularly Australian comedians, you do not want to big yourself up for anything. It's always, I suck, I'm terrible.
Yeah,
it's why we get such culture shock talking to an American who seems to like themselves.
It's weird, isn't it?
You would have just had this experience.
And you're self-deprecating and they say, oh no. I'm trying to be funny.
Someone tried to I was doing a meeting over there and someone read out my credits and I was like, oh yeah, it's not that big a deal. And they just went, oh okay. And moved on and I had to then double back and be like, no, it is a big deal. I've worked very hard for it.
I know you have to. I mean, and I love American culture so much. You know, we grew up on watching, being targeted ads for stuff that you couldn't buy. You know, I love it so much. But it is such a fun and strange culture because so much of it is subtext. Yeah. And I remember once making this huge mistake where I was getting a shuttle bus or something it was just me and this guy and he was taking me to a festival, a cinema, and I said, I genuinely didn't know if I tipped him or not. And I said, hey, can I ask you a question? Do I tip you? And it was like I'd asked him for a kidney. It was the most awkward, horrible thing I've ever done. It was this huge faux pas. And then recently I was over there, I was just using ChatGPT, saying, how much do I tip this drive? How much do I tip this and this? It's fun, but weird, isn't it? It's a weird, there are lots of little cultural differences.
And then, so how do you find, is there a element of, say, Australian crime fiction or Australian horror fiction that you find very different? Because in the same way, we grew up on, you referenced Stephen King a bit and stuff, and absolutely. I grew up loving Stephen King's work and stuff. Do you find that we, have a unique voice in that area?
Yeah, I do, and I think that working because I've done American shows and movies and Australian ones, and I think one of the things that I learnt really early on that I think more people need to learn is that when you're writing for an Australian voice, you have to write it for an Australian voice, and so often you'll be watching something and you'll think, oh, they've written this with an American voice in mind because that's how we think. And I remember playing as a kid, and I'd always have an American accent. My daughter does it now, where when she's playing, I'm listening to her, and she's got this thick American accent, and it's because that's what she watches. And I think there's this temptation to, when you write, you're thinking, I don't know, Americans can get away with things that Australians can't, and vice versa. 100%, and it was a huge thing I learnt very, very early on, where you've got to think about that voice, otherwise it feels like nothing. It feels fake.
It must be so hard, particularly in something like this, where you have revelations, you have secrets that need to come out, and you have deep psychology, and you have Australians don't talk, in a way, Americans are the most therapy speaking country on earth, whereas we're not going to sit here and be like, well, here's how I psychoanalyze my own problems.
Yeah, well, that's what I kind of love about it, because it's almost like writing. It's a bit like when you write something in the 80s and 90s and you don't have to worry about text messaging. Yeah. When you write something set in Australia, you don't really have to worry. You don't have to think. It's okay if they haven't talked to their family members about their deep, dark secrets.
Yeah,
there's more room for for secrets and darkness and collusion and stuff like that, because it is sort of what we like, especially with sensitive things. And I've got 2 brothers and lots of male energy in my life, and we love each other and are supportive. And my dad is always saying gushy things, but with me and the brothers, it's never. I'll see one brother in particular, Jamie. We'll see each other and we'll just start teasing each other. We regress and we'll fight physically. Yes. And he's pulling me down and pushing me on the floor, and that's how we kind of bond and communicate. And I think that's such a male thing, but also such an Australian thing. So it's sort of weirdly weirdly easier, I guess.
I can also say I have 2 older sisters and we still can be on-site fighting.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, it's this weird regression that goes, especially when you kind of leave and then come back.
That's what I really liked about this because we both have stories that talk about hometowns in different ways, and I really like how you reflect community in your hometown, but also the idea of as soon as you touch dirt there, you are 14 years old.
Yeah, you are. Yeah,
doesn't matter how old you actually are.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny that, you know, when I think of it, iconic Australian things, very quickly my mind does go to big stuff. I don't want to ask a generic question, but I do kind of want to know, were you at a big thing when you came up with the idea? I hate that that's a generic question, but I'm actually genuinely curious.
It was, so I was actually moving to work on my first TV job, which was the Weekly with Charlie Pickering, and I had to move to Melbourne for the first time. I had never been to Melbourne aside from like one weekend to scout the place before I moved down.
You're based in Sydney?
I'm based in Sydney, and I ended up living down there for a decade. But on this first trip down, I didn't know. All I knew was the Paul Kelly song, like from St Kilda to King's Cross. Okay, it's about a 13-hour drive. I knew that, and I knew aim down, and I thought, that'll be enough. I'll just hit that.
Yeah, you'll get there.
I planned the trip by hitting every big thing along the way.
That's brilliant.
And then so when I came to write this, I was like, this is such a weird and iconic part of our culture, but I hadn't seen it turn up in anything before. Yeah.
Honestly, that's when I read your, you know, I said this before we started doing this, but, you know, I love the book, but it that occurred to me. It's like, why? This is this weird thing that we do. Yeah. Why hasn't anyone explored it until now?
It's like we're almost ashamed of it, whereas you'd think it would turn up in like you could imagine a scene in that like Sydney Sweeney Glenn Powell film where they have to go and see the big prawn.
Exactly, yeah.
I think it's so hard to, like, this was part of the challenge of this was how do you explain these things to anyone who is not familiar with Australia's culture?
Yeah.
That, like, you have to get both the idea that they exist, but also the ubiquity of them and that everyone knows about them.
I'm curious about when you said you planned that trip to go to every big thing. Was that a solo trip? Were you by yourself?
That was a solo trip.
What did you? Did you stop? I want to know how you stopped. Then what your face was like. What did you do? Did you kind of enjoy it, or did you stare at it? Did you gaze, reflect? You know, did you reflect? What was that like?
So it was definitely like a photo at each one, and the only one that was the big merino, which you famously have to take a picture of its balls.
Brilliant, yep.
Very atomically correct big thing there. It was mostly like just... It was weird to say moments of peace, because it was such a long drive. I was alone. I had hired a van to go one way that had a crumpled door, so there was no radio, and it beeped the whole way down the highway.
Oh, brilliant! Like torture.
I was going completely mad, and so I would stop off. It's really sadistic now I think about it. I would stop off, stare at a giant Ned Kelly, get in the car again, keep going.
That's what I pictured. I pictured this guy pulling out. It's in a van now. You're a serial killer, exactly. And you get out and you stare at this big thing, and you get back in the van and you drive off. Who is this psychopath?
It is frankly insane that ASIO didn't stop me at some point.
Yeah, they would definitely. You're on a watch list for sure. We've been given the wrap-up signal. This was so good. We met 10 seconds before we came in, and now I feel like we know. This is great. This is such a cool thing.
Let's never talk again until we're back here.
Every time we have a book out, we'll come back, do this, and then nothing. No correspondence. Yeah, perfect.